How many times have you heard something along these lines over the last few days? The Iran War was a strategic failure for the United States. For centuries, the Strait of Hormuz remained open to all. The principle of freedom of navigation reigned, ensuring that trade could transit the strait without issue. But by starting the Iran War, the United States taught the supreme leader, well, I guess this supreme leader, or then again, maybe not. Anyway, by starting the Iran War, the United States taught whoever is in charge of Iran that the Strait of Hormuz is a coercive tool. By just threatening to blow up any tanker that passes, Iran can de facto close the strait. Oil prices will immediately surge. Whole economies will risk long-term recessions. The world will buckle to Iran's every threat, or at least most threats, lest Iran repeat this process. The genie is out of the bottle, and there is no putting it back in. Now, I cannot say that the Iran War was a good idea. Answering that question would require knowing exactly how much Iranian materiel and production infrastructure the United States destroyed. It would require knowing how quickly Iran can reconstruct those assets. It would require knowing whether increasing the resolve of the new leader, whoever that may be, is more than offset by that destruction. It would require knowing what percentage of US stockpiles were depleted during the war. It would require knowing how quickly the United States can replenish them. It would require knowing Beijing's timeline to invading Taiwan. I think that we all have our priors about each of these. Unfortunately, getting a good answer to any of them both requires access to classified information and knowledge of the future. Even beginning to try to sort out any one of them would take 15 minutes. So we are going to sidestep those questions today for a much simpler one. How much has the world lost as a consequence of Iran learning of the power of closing the Strait of Hormuz? And the answer is basically nothing. Yes, a lot of ink has been wasted arguing the opposite, but there are two fundamental problems with that theory. One is the fallacy of knowledge, and the other is the conflation of this particular conflict with a future one where Iran is actively trying to coerce someone else. Understanding both of these points is critical for having a better grasp of the region's bigger strategic picture, so that is where we are spending our time today. Let's start with the fallacy in thinking. And it seems that we keep encountering this problem in new and interesting ways, so we need a name for it. Let's call it the amateur's fallacy. The amateur's fallacy arises when someone learns a fact, often through observation, and assumes that experts were oblivious to it beforehand, when experts were in fact well aware of it, even if they had never observed it in practice before. The version of this that we have encountered most recently is in the nuclear realm. Remember the idea that the last few years of war have demonstrated that nuclear weapons are the only way to guarantee your country's survival? And thus, more countries will try to sprint toward building a nuclear weapon? No one will make a Ukraine mistake or an Iran mistake again? In fact, people who work in the national security sphere, in particular, the people deciding whether to build nuclear weapons, already knew that this is how it works, and so recent events have little impact on their decisions. What the amateurs just discovered was already priced into the experts' decisions. Countries that are not currently building nuclear weapons chose that path because the cost was not worth the profit. They may recalculate the benefits on a regular basis, but their formula is not going to magically change this year to include a column for nuclear weapons are good at deterring decapitation strikes. That column was always there. Well, it is amazing what else experts know without having to observe something directly. Perhaps as an easier case, we do not need to see someone open their pressure suits while on a spacewalk on the dark side of the moon to know that that would be a bad idea. We do not need to have Taiwan destroy all of its semiconductor fabs to know that it would trigger a global economic meltdown. We do not need to send someone traveling at about 92% the speed of light to the star Tau Ceti to know that the astronaut would get there in about 4 years from his perspective, but 13 for those of us chilling on Earth. and we do not need to see the Strait of Hormuz get shut down to know that it would cause all sorts of havoc in the world. Actually, there is an interesting inconsistency in common public narratives about the war. You will get a paragraph about how everyone with a pulse knew that closing the Strait of Hormuz was a nightmare scenario, often with some commentary about how the White House was the lone exception. Then, one paragraph later, the topic will be that Iran has learned how closing the strait is a valuable tool, and now we are stuck in our brave new world. Well, it cannot be both ways. Either it is obvious to everyone, including, and especially Iran, or we are all a bunch of oblivious dummies. I know that I am preaching to the choir here by engaging in a parasocial relationship with people who have fun, learning about just how screwed we are as a species, but it was indeed obvious to everyone, and that everyone includes the folks pulling the strings in Tehran. And even for policymakers who completely refuse to use theory to project how effective coercive strategy will be, you only have to look at the other side of the Arabian Peninsula to see the problem in action. Only about 2.5 years ago, the Houthis, which might be generously described as a state-like actor, froze shipping through the Bab el-Mandab Strait by commandeering a vessel and threatening to do more. It does not take a room full of Pentagon PhDs to understand that if a glorified militant group dependent on Iran for weapons was capable of shutting down shipping, that Iran could easily do the same. There is a reason why we collectively referred to closing Hormuz as a nuclear option. None of us should come out of this surprised that shutting down the strait would lead to significant consequences for the world at large. In sum, Iran was always capable of closing Hormuz. No one in Tehran suddenly got that brilliant idea on February 28th, and has since been trying to figure out how to apply it under various new conditions. Rather, Iranian military planners simply dusted off that playbook, and it will go back on the shelf after this war ends. It is a playbook that Iran may eventually grab from the shelf again, but it will remain useful only under a limited set of circumstances. To wit, the other half of the story is how the Hormuz shutdown only worked because of how international audiences reacted to the war. If you told global consumers that tomorrow gas prices will increase by 25%, I bet they would get angry at the culprit. Moreover, they may very well approve implementing coercive measures to try to get the culprit to pull back. Well, right now, the world views the United States as the culprit. And within the United States, the majority of voters view the Trump administration as the culprit. Yes, obviously Iran is the one preventing tankers from passing through the strait. Iran is also the one targeting oil infrastructure in neighboring Arab countries. But these individuals see a clear line between the United States initiating airstrikes and those countermeasures afterward. None of them may like Iran. None of them may want the supreme leader to continue ruling over Iran. But they see this as a straightforward consequence of U.S. actions, and thus the political blame has gone toward the White House. So let's imagine that things go back to normal, and tankers return to transiting the strait without issue. But then another country does something that Iran does not like. Maybe it is Israel making a play in Lebanon. Maybe it is Saudi Arabia going after the Houthis. According to the argument, Iran has learned that it can close the strait to get its way, and so Iran will close the strait to get its way. If the Iran war had never happened, Tehran would not have discovered this option, and so it would not be a consideration in this hypothetical scenario. Okay, I asked this in response. How would the world respond to such an action from Iran? Iran was not involved in the original action, but the supreme leader injected himself into the situation. The difference here is night and day compared to the present. The international community would not see Iran as the target, but rather as the instigator. Correspondingly, international patience for Iran would be approximately 0. We have already seen this principle in practice. Back during the Iran-Iraq War, both sides had a fun time attacking tankers inside of the Gulf. But one thing that Iran did not try to do is close the strait. Even though Iraq began the war by invading Iran, the Iranian government knew that the rest of the world would believe that Iran had triggered the action, and so an intervention against Iran would follow. Heck, Iraq desperately tried to provoke Iran into closing the thing precisely because it would backfire. Moving back to the present, think about what would happen if a Western adjacent country started blowing up another country's oil refineries. You might expect that the response would be outrage and coercive pressure to get that country to stop. But if that country is Ukraine, and Ukraine is doing that in response to Russia's invasion, then Ukraine gets a pass. Heck, some countries might even assist Ukraine in executing those strikes. A similar sort of phenomenon would happen at the US domestic level. The current war is unprecedentedly unpopular because it is causing financial strain, and most voters do not see a clear upshot. That is another way to repeat the idea that they do not like higher gas prices and that they blame the president. So fast forward a year or two, and imagine that something happens in the world that sets off the supreme leader. He closes the strait. What happens next? Well, that same public outcry that we have seen regarding the United States now gets applied to Iran. Heck, it'll probably run deeper given the much longer running animosity against the Islamic Republic. The handcuffs come off. The bizarre political tension of the Trump administration trying to calm markets while destroying Iran are no longer in tension. Some of the equally bizarre choices that the United States has made during the war, like allowing Iranian oil to pass through the strait, no longer happen. Karg Island switches from being a possibility to an inevitability. Closing the strait turns from a one-sided power play to mutually assured destruction. That is partially why the analogy of closing the strait as a nuclear option is fitting. Nuclear weapons are not particularly useful for making offensive threats, to compel opponents to change their behavior. In contrast, nuclear weapons are great for defensive threats, to deter opponents from taking an extremely aggressive action against you. The funny thing is that we do not need to see a nuclear weapon actually used to understand that. We know that already, and it is the same for the Strait of Hormuz. Zooming out, I think that the same people who discuss Iran having learned about the power of closing the strait understand the difference in using the strategy as a defensive response versus as an active coercive measure. If this learning experience truly meant that Iran would be forever able to hold the world hostage, then they would be supporting the United States in trying to militarily prevent Iran from doing it. The reason that they do not is because the White House created the crisis, and there is some expectation that it will go away once the United States pulls back. Now, why they continue to discuss Iran having learned about this power is a bit of a sociological mystery to me. Maybe it is because it sounds smart to the amateur audience, but really, it is the amateur's fallacy. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? There is a ton of chatter about how we live in a new world where Iran now knows the power it controls via the strait. In fact, however, Iran, and anyone with an interest in this field, was already aware of it. And Iran cannot implement another shutdown and expect to see the same type of international indifference and response if Iran is the one that's instigating it. But you can expect to see my standard ending for this, yet another day of is it a war or isn't it a war? Keep the party going by perusing my playlist on the broader Middle East conflict. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.